Hello and welcome. My name is Reinhard Partmann. In this objective, we are going to talk about the network requirements and port requirements regarding Horizon solutions and Workspace ONE solutions. So let's get started. We are going to talk about network connections basically. We will have them east, west, north, south, inbound, outbound, and in all directions and from all components. And this will be a huge list of ports, protocols, components and stuff. So let's get started. First of all, with client connections. With the client connections, we have basically internal connections and external connections. So internal connections means that we are connecting from on-premise to on-premise components, and with external we are talking about connections which are coming, let's say, from home offices, remote offices, to our centralized desktop infrastructure. On VMware Tech Zone, you will find the port requirements for Horizon connections. And there you have an extensive list who is talking to whom with all the protocols. I've opened this up already, and when we go inside, the first diagram will blow your mind because you have basically every connection there. Prepare to have a good high resolution big screen so that you can zoom in as deep as you want, because you will find all the details there and many lines and all the protocols, and so that you can have a good overview. If you really go down to the Horizon client, you will find a lot of components and who is talking to whom. Let's say we have the internal connection and the Horizon is connecting to the connection server. We have the authentication connection over port 443. And then we have the contact from the client to the agent over several ports. This is because he's handling out the display protocol which is supported. What do you want to use? Depending on the display protocol, different ports are obviously used. Let's go into the list and let's walk it slightly through. TCP 22443 is the Blast Extreme protocol, and it's using TCP and UDP depending on the network speed which is available. If you're going to use PCOIP, you are going to use port 4172, also TCP and UDP. And if you're going to use RDP, it's the port 3389 as it has always been. There are several other ports like the multimedia redirection 9427 and 32111 for USB redirection. So again, what is the important thing about this list and the protocols? You need to talk with your network administrators that the ports are open from the client to the agent, that the ports are open from the client to your connection broker, because these all are internal connections. So the second set of these internal connections are, if you're not using the VMware Horizon client, you could also leverage the use of an HTML5 browser. There are slightly different ports. Why is that? Because the connection to the connection server is still 443. The authentication there made from the connection server to the backend are also the same. But 8443 is being leveraged, and also 22443 directly to the agent. If you're going to use mobile devices, you will have additional ports there to be opened, because these mobile devices are opening through the Identity Manager authentication ports like 88 for Kerberos on iOS devices or 5262 for authentication methods used by Android. So again, you need to walk through this list depending on your use case, depending on your client device, depending on your client software, what connection you are going to make. Again, if you go down the list, you find another diagram which is only talking about external connections. If we talk about external connections, something else comes into play. You have an additional component, and this additional component is our Unified Access Gateway, or also called UAG. The client will connect to the UAG first, and from the UAG the connection will be proxied to the endpoint. Also, the connection will be made to your connection server, where the connection is being brokered and authenticated. So if we go into our list again, we will see that the Horizon client is talking to our UAG over port 443. If you're going to use PCOIP as display protocol, TCP UDP port 4172 is used again. For Blast Extreme, we are also leveraging UDP 443 and 8443 in several use cases. But we also can use 443 only. This has a big advantage because of the reason that the 443 protocol is almost always open from coffee shops, hotspots, hotel LANs, right? Port A443, however, there is a possibility that this port cannot be opened. And this is also a big advantage if you're going to use the Blast protocol over PCOIP, because you will need the port 4172 in TCP and UDP be open to make a successful connection. If you're going to use the browser, again, you will hit the UAG, you need to authenticate there, and again, you need to go all through the list again. If you are using a mobile device and use the authentication on the mobile device and over single sign-on, you will need to use port 88 again for Kerberos on iOS and port 5262 on Android devices. When you go on the techzone.vmware.com, you will find the network port requirements for Horizon. This document is available to you in two formats. Format one is basically the website, and the second one is a PDF. Let's switch for a short time into the PDF. And we are going to talk here again for the external connection, which shows all the display protocols when we are going to use the UAG, right? So let's zoom in, because we have a lot of information there, and unless we zoom in, we will not see everything. So when a client builds up a connection, the client hits the UAG first. Depending on the display protocol you are using, connections are built up to the backend. First, there is an XML connection which reaches out. You can see it here, XML connection, the red arrow, which goes down to the Tomcat part of our connection broker. The connection broker, again, in turn is asking Active Directory if the username and password combination is right and correct. If this comes back okay, the authentication is valid, and this information is being passed back through the UAG and back to the client. On the other hand, the connection broker is brokering a connection to one of your VDI agents, and this is the desktop which is then being presented to you. But what else is happening in the backend? Depending on the display protocol you are going to use, you can see that we have here the possibility of having Blast, PCOIP, or RDP. Depending on the display protocol, different ports are being used. If you are going to use PCOIP, it's 4172. If it's Blast, it's 443 or 8443. It's better to use 443 because this port is almost always open from any network your client could sit in, right? Depending on which display protocol you're using, a different component within the UAG is being used, right? And from the UAG, the connection is then built to the Horizon agent. And from that point on, the display and keyboard, mouse, and screen session is running. But that's not all what's happening again. You see that we have the user environment agent and the app volumes agent. And all those agents are starting also their connections. The user environment agent is building up the connection to the file sharers and loading all the persistence data for the desktop, and the app volumes agent is going to talk to the App Volumes Manager, right? And the App Volumes Manager, in turn, is also talking to vRealize operations and also to your vCenter server. Why is it talking to the vCenter server? Because the vCenter server is telling the ESXi hosts, if it's configured that way, that some app stacks should be attached to the currently logged on virtual machine so that applications become available. And now you see why all these components are talking to each other and need to talk to each other, because otherwise either you don't even get your screen sessions. If you get your screen session and UEM cannot reach out to the file server, you don't have your persistent settings and your Windows settings and your application settings in place. And if App Volumes cannot communicate with the vCenter server and the rest of the backend, you will not have your applications within your desktop. So you see, it's crucial, elemental, that all the network requirements are set up. So let's go back to the slides. The third option basically are tunneled connection here. Those tunnel connections are less frequently used now because this functionality is also available in our UAG. Tunnel connections, there is the whole connection being tunneled through our connection server. This has a small disadvantage, because if you are going to reboot the connection server, all connections are being dropped, right? So, and from that perspective, it's in the documentation, it's still there, but it's being less frequently used nowadays. If you, however, stumble upon an older view environment and you have still security servers in place and you have external connections, please confirm that you are using tunneled connections, because otherwise you will have a security leak. And because of that, networks need to be open to external networks and stuff like that. So your network and firewall administrators, they will hunt you down for that. We now had client connections. But in an Horizon environment, we have a lot of other components. We have our connection broker, we have Active Directory, we have our Identity Manager, we have our UAGs, we have our App Volumes Managers, we have our User Environment Manager, we have our vCenter servers, ESX servers who basically run our virtual machines, we have our VMware ThinApp file server shares, and vRealize operations for monitoring. So let's go now through the list what they can provide and what network ports are actually required for that. Here you see now an overview of all the components and how they are talking together. At the end of the day, we have our virtualization infrastructure, which is running virtual machines. Those components are our ESXi hosts managed by vCenter. They talk to each other. Then we build out our connection server. The connection server is talking to the vCenter, and the vCenter in turn is providing and creating virtual machines for the connection server. We also have our App Volumes Manager, which is getting information from the agent which is running in the virtual machine that app stacks should be detached or attached. When virtual machines are booting up and users are logging on, the UEM agent is sending information to our UEM manager and loading all the necessary information from the file shares which are required to run the user environment manager, or in short UEM for view. Basically, these are persistent settings for applications and the Windows desktop environment, and so on and so forth. So let's go through the list and let's have a look what we can find there. So let's start with our virtualization infrastructure, which is basically our connection server, vCenter, and our ESXi hosts. You can see that they mostly connect over 443 TCP, and they also have 902, which is our console and SOAP message communication within vCenter and ESXi hosts. If we have vRealize operations in enterprise environments for performance monitoring, and as you can see, we have a lot of other ports which are required by our vRealize operations agent, which is a part of our View Horizon agent. This performance monitoring agent needs to communicate back and forth with our connection server and our vRealize operations manager server backend. With custom dashboards and standard dashboards on the web interface of the vRealize Operations Manager, you can leverage and drill down into the performance measurement data, which are being collected and transferred to those management stations. So you can do, let's say, end-to-end performance monitoring on PCOYP and BLAST, because you will see how long are the connections and how long is the round trip times and stuff like that. This is very important in connections which are running over wide area networks, because in LAN environments you most likely have a sufficient speed available to you, but if it goes over the internet, you will have, well, let's say, a not as fast connection usually, and you have sometimes a little better speed, a little bit slower speed. You will have higher and lower round trip times. And as part of that, the user experience is not always as consistent as in LAN environments. And when you see those measurements, you need to reevaluate your performance and optimization settings in your display protocols maybe. Or maybe you need a faster line in your data center or a faster line at your client side. So all of these measurements need to be reevaluated if user complaints are coming up, right? The next topic we are talking about is App Volumes Manager. You will see that the App Volumes Manager to the vCenter and the ESXi hosts is only talking about port 443. But the App Volumes Manager needs an SQL database where it's persisting its configuration data. And for that you need the port 1433 TCP open. On top of that, there is the App Volumes Manager agent, and the App Volumes Manager agent needs to communicate with the App Volumes Manager either over port 80 or port 443 if you have an SSL secured connection there. Let's assume you are going to use the VMware Identity Manager as a front-end for authentication. Then we need additional ports, but not only that, we also need the Identity Manager connector, because the Identity Manager connector basically is reaching out to your backend authentication systems to make everything happen, right? So if you look at the table, like always, we have port 443 in use. This is an outgoing connection from your Identity Manager connector to your Identity Manager connector. Maybe it's on-prem or it's a cloud-hosted service. The Identity Manager connector, however, will reach out to your backend systems too. Let's assume you have Active Directory in place. It will reach out to your domain controller over port 389 or 636 if it's an SSL secured connection. It will use port 3268 Active Directory Global Catalog. It will use port 88 for Kerberos and 464 TCP or UDP if you're doing a Kerberos password change. So again, you need to consult every manual and the network prerequisites if you're going to do a secure network setup, because you have a lot of components which are talking to each other. Unless you have a correct configuration set up, your communication will fail or authentication will not go through. Okay? On the next slide, we also have when the connector is talking your domain control over port 135 or 53, which is the DNS we already know. Again, you also have port 123 in place, which is NTP, the Network Time Protocol. And if you're going to leverage the ThinApp repository, it's going to use port 445 over the CIFS share. If you're going to use the Online Certificate Status Protocol, or in short OCSP, port 80 TCP will also be used. And when you are using your OCSP server, you also should whitelist the OCSP server's URL in your firewall, so that all components which are using those OCSP server can reach out to this URL. So now we have talked about all about network port requirements. So where do I find all these requirements? You have the Workspace ONE reference architecture. There you have around about 13 to 14 slides of which component is the source component, which is this destination component, which protocol is in use, which port is in use, and a very short description of the communication path. Then you should reference to the network port requirements, which I have shown you regarding to Horizon and Workspace ONE 2. So this sums it really up. You need to know who is talking to whom. So consult your Horizon manual, Workspace ONE manual, UEM manual, Identity Manager manual, and ESX and vCenter manual. Because at the end of the day, you need all of them if you're running every component. And having that said, this is a really big list. You need to go it step by step, line by line, and also with your firewall administrators, because they will question you to every line and why you will actually need it.